Thank you all for joining us this morning. Good morning to those of you here at CSIS, as well as those of you online. My name is Victor Cha. I'm the Senior Vice President for Asia at CSIS and Korea Chair. I'm also professor at Georgetown University. And we're very happy this morning to have scholars joining us from Stanford University, as well as Georgetown University, to present and to comment on some new research that Professor Shin's research lab at Stanford has been doing. Here in the DC area, DC policy circles, we often throw about terms, but probably none more than how to characterize the nature of competition between the United States and China. And so the first presentation is going to look at this question by Dr. Shinru Ma, who is a research scholar at Stanford. The discussant for this paper, so what we wanted to do was pair these rising junior scholars with some of the senior scholars in the field, and particularly senior scholars who operate both in the realm of scholarship and policy. And so for this first paper, that will discuss Dr. Ma's work will be Dr. Evan Medeiros, my colleague at Georgetown, professor in the School of Foreign Service and Asian Studies, holder of the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies, and also the author of a new book, I think it's called, is it Cold Rivals or Cold Rivalry? Cold Rivals, New Era in U.S. China Strategic Competition, published by Georgetown University Press, so very appropriate for the topic. The second paper will look at how the U.S. China relationship and the evolving debate in policy circles here in the U.S. affects the views of allies and partners. That will be presented by Dr. Ki-Dong Kim, postdoctoral scholar also at Stanford, and comments by my other colleague at Georgetown, Professor Matt Kronig, who's a professor in the government department and the School of Foreign Service, also, I think, vice president or senior vice, I don't see him here, he's probably coming later, he can correct me, for the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council, also the author of a book on great power rivalry between the United States and China. So very appropriate scholars, practitioners to discuss both of these papers. So to get us started, I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Gi-Uk Shin, who is director of the Shorenstein Center for Asia-Pacific Research, the Asia-Pacific Research Center, or APARC, at Stanford. He also holds the William J. Perry Chair at Stanford, professor of sociology, and he is the founder of this new research lab that he'll tell you a little bit about at Stanford. So let me turn the floor over to Gi-Uk, and let me welcome everybody again this morning.
Okay, thank you, Victor, and good morning. Good morning. So if you're joining us from California, it's pretty early, and hopefully you have good coffee to wake up. But it's really nice to be back here. We had one joint event about 2 years ago, and I really like to thank my friend and colleague, Professor Victor Cha, for his warm welcomes. Also, I'd like to thank our generous supporters and partners for helping make this trip possible. And in particular, I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Freeman Spogli Institute Policy Engagement Fund for their support for this trip. So our SNAPL team is very grateful to be here today in DC. In addition to Dr. Shinru Ma and Ki-Dong Kim, who will be presenting today, I'm happy to have our team members, Dr. Junki Nakahara, you want to stand up? And Brendan Yoder here today at this symposium. Okay, so as Victor mentioned, last summer we launched a new policy lab, what we call Stanford's Next Asia Policy Lab. So as you may know, lab is a very popular model in science and it's getting popular in social science as well. But in terms of Asian studies, we might be the first one to try. So you can see that the acronym is SNAPL. So sounds like a drink, but only one P, and there's no E. But you can think about SNAPL. So if you look at the picture, anyone has any idea which city does it show? Any idea? No idea? Okay, this is an AI-generated picture for future of Asia. So we'll see maybe 5 or 10 years later what Asia will look like. Okay, so here is our main mission in establishing this policy lab. So as you can see, we are trying to address emergent social, cultural, economic, and political challenges facing Asia and U.S.-Asia relationship, adopting interdisciplinary, problem-oriented, policy-relevant, and comparative approach, so that we can provide evidence-based policy implications for what we call Next Asia and U.S.-Asia relations. And we like to function as a platform to collaborate with institutions in Asia and elsewhere. And in our lab, there are 4 research tracks. So one is talent development and talent flows and development. And actually, I have a book coming out next year by Stanford University Press called Talent Giant. So we are comparing Japan, Australia, India, and China in terms of their talent strategies. The second one, nationalism and racism. So tomorrow, Junki Nakahara will be presenting her research called Racism Denial in Asia at George Washington University. So if you have time, please come tomorrow afternoon at the SIGA Center. And third one, U.S.-Asia relations, and then we'll be presenting findings from this track today. And then finally, democratic crisis and reform. So you can visit our website. We are now looking for applications for postdoc and also visiting fellow in the coming years. So if you or anyone around you are interested in applying, please visit our website. Okay, today you will be hearing about exciting research findings we have for the U.S.-Asia relations track. This track was born out of the continued interest in U.S. relations with the rising powers, especially those from Asia. As you know, previously the U.S. has enjoyed decades of U.S.-led unipolar world system, but the rise of China has led to challenges in Sino-U.S. relations. Okay, this research track aims to correct some misunderstanding about the nature of the U.S.-China relations and trying to provide empirical findings for more effective foreign policy strategies for the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. So as an academic institution, we have no political agenda. Let me be very clear. And I love blue or red tie, but I'm wearing green today to avoid any misunderstanding. And we're really trying to provide empirically rich findings for policy discussions. So in that spirit, you will hear first from Dr. Shinru Ma, who is a research fellow at SNAPL. Her area of expertise are on great power politics and East Asian security, with a methodological focus on formal and computational models. So she will present research focusing on a pertinent debate regarding the new Cold War between U.S. and China. Okay, these findings, using a comparative computational analysis of congressional discourse, challenge the claim of a new Cold War between the U.S. and China and show alternative, more accurate historical comparisons, especially U.S. and Japan. And as Victor mentioned, we are very lucky to have Dr. Evan Medrios from Georgetown to serve as a discussant for this session. Okay, next, you will hear from Dr. Ki-dong Kim, who is a SNAPL and Korea Program postdoctoral fellow. He studies public opinion on foreign policy with a regional focus on Northeast Asia. So Ki-dong will present about the nuance and international context that influence the rise of anti-China sentiments among citizens in U.S. allied countries, using survey data from multiple countries in the Asia-Pacific region. We are also fortunate to have Dr. Matthew Kronick as the discussant for this session. Okay, so I think each presenter will speak about 30 minutes, and then discussant like 10 to 15 minutes. Then we'll open the floor to Q&A. And as you know, we are live streaming at C-SPAN and also through CSIS YouTube channel. So if you're joining online, please submit your questions so we can take some of them for your questions online. And we love to get your feedback on both presentations because we will be presenting or publishing both projects as journal articles. So finally, if you have any good suggestions for collaborative projects, please let us know, as we are always looking for more opportunities to expand our research. So thank you again for your attendance and look forward to our presentations and discussions. So without any further ado, so Shinu, you want to come over to present? Okay, so let's welcome Dr. Ma and Evan. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shinru Ma. I'm a research scholar at SNAPL, leading the track on U.S. China, U.S.-Asia relations. Thanks a lot for joining us today. So I'm really excited to share with you one of the SNAPL projects that challenges the prevailing narrative of a new Cold War between the U.S. and China, and show how evidence from 36 years of congressional speeches tells a different story. Our motivation comes from the commonly held assumption in the media, policy, and academic circles about the return of the Cold War dynamics between the US and China. As you can see, recent headlines from very prominent outlets have shown the growing perception that the two great powers have entered or will enter soon a new Cold War. However, it is very important for us to take a step back and ask, is this analogy empirically accurate? So we argue that the current U.S.-China rivalry should not be labeled as a new Cold War for three reasons in particular. The first one is our analysis established a baseline expectation about the Cold War. So historically, Cold War debates have focused on two themes: ideological expansion and military aggression, with the ideological expansion being the primary focus. I'm going to show you data to validate this point. Second, we don't really see the same dynamics reflected in discussions about China. So specifically, ideological concerns about China are mentioned, but they focus less on the outward ideological expansion, but more on issues like human rights. On the other hand, the military concerns about China is more about a budgetary consideration rather than the direct confrontations that define the Cold War. So lastly, by placing today's U.S.-China rivalry in the context of how the U.S. has historically talked about its major rivals, we find that it shares more in common with the U.S.-Japan economic rivalry of the 1980s. In this case, economic competition and domestic agendas take precedence over ideological and military concerns. So I know those kind of conclusions might not sound surprising to you, but we're going to show you empirically how the analysis based on our data will support each of them. So in particular, I'm going to substantiate these findings in 4 steps. The first one is I'm going to explain the motivations between the motivations behind both supporters and opponents of the new Cold War analogy, and why, despite all the rich discussions we've had as of now, our understanding of this analogy is still insufficient. Next, I will show why taking a comparative approach, which is the key theme of all the projects in our lab, is essential, and how looking at historical congressional debates can give us fresh insights into the U.S.-China rivalry. So in the third step, I'm going to present the empirical findings, focusing on the 3 key points that I just mentioned earlier. The baseline expectations, the significant differences with China, and the parallels with the U.S.-Japan rivalry. So I will conclude by discussing the policy implications of these findings. So the existing debate. A key argument from the supporters of the new Cold War analogy is the ideological confrontation between the 2 major powers. So during the Cold War, the spread of communism was seen as the central concern or threat by the US. The competition influenced not only foreign policies, as demonstrated by the Truman Doctrine or the Marshall Plan, but also had a significant impact on domestic society, shaping phenomena such as the Red Scale. Today, similar fears are being raised. The proponents have argued that China's growing influence in developing countries, especially in regions as Africa or Latin America, through initiatives like the Belt and the Road Initiative, this is seen as an attempt to spread a model of governance that stands in sharp contrast to the Western liberal democracy and poses a direct challenge to the current international order. Proponents also point out to the U.S.-China military competition in the Asia-Pacific and their global power projection. So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union adopted a very aggressive posture towards its neighboring countries, especially in Eastern Europe, and showed a willingness to use military force both directly and indirectly to support the communist regimes in other regions. Fast forward to today, China's assertiveness in the South China Sea and towards Taiwan has led many to believe that China has derailed its peaceful rise. Critics have argued that China is systematically attempting to change or transform the South China Sea into its naval base, and that this regional dominance would serve as a springboard for its broader ambitions on the global stage. But on the other hand, opponents of the new Cold War analogy downplayed the importance of ideological and military confrontations. And instead, they focus on the economic interdependence between the 2 nations. So they point out that today's global economy is much more intertwined than it was during the Cold War. The global trade now accounts for about 60% of the GDP in comparison to just like 24% during the Cold War time. The higher level of this interdependence makes it significantly more difficult for the US, its allies, or any third-party countries to align themselves into this kind of distinct blocks, as was done during the Cold War. So here, an analyst and scholars have identified various areas of this interdependence between China and US, including global governance, climate cooperations, supply chain management, and even public health here in the United States. But most importantly, the importance of interdependence has been questioned by the proponents of the analogy. as interdependence itself can sometimes, but not always, prevent conflicts. And in fact, when nations rely on each other economically, tensions over trade, resources, or investment can create new areas of conflicts. So this is why, despite the rich debates, our assessment of whether the US and China are in a new Cold War still remains insufficient. And in particular, there are three weaknesses that we see. The first one is there's no clear benchmarks. The Cold War itself lasted over for 4 decades, and the relationship between the US and the Soviet Union, they really swung between intense conflict and a periodical cooperation. So this variation itself made it very hard to pinpoint which aspect of Cold War dynamics people are referring to when they say it's a new Cold War. So this lack of a clear, quantifiable empirical basis has created a situation where the areas of similarities and differences between the Cold War and the U.S.-China relations today are well noted. As I just mentioned, nobody can actually question there's no difference at all between today's situation and the Cold War. But the issue is the extent of those similarities and the differences remains unclear. And that's why each camp can be reasonable and be correct, but their conclusions can be incomplete, and it's very hard for them to convince each other on that sense. So the lack of clear benchmarks lead to the situation when the areas of differences and similarities are clear, but the degree of that kind of similarity and differences are very unclear. The second weakness is the single reference point. So as of now, all the analysis just refer to Soviet Union as the only reference point. So relying on this just one historical references limits our ability to separate universal factors from country-specific ones when we define rivalries. So after all, the Soviet Union wasn't the only rival that captured US attention. Like China today, Japan in the 1980s was seen as a rising power threatening US dominance in trade, technology, and innovation. So as Japan's economic power surged, its influence in the Asia-Pacific grew, and the US was worried that Japan could upset the regional balance of power through its militarization and become a destabilizing force in the region, even though Japan was a US ally. Still US ally. So adopting a historical comparison offers us a broader framework for understanding rivalry relationship, which would help define more accurately the nature of the US-China competition. And last and most importantly, existing analysis has almost exclusively focused on structural factors like military power, economic growth. So those structural factors matter, but it is also important to note that rivalry itself are relationships that are selected and sustained by subjective perceptions. So how countries perceive each other, categorize each other, and react to those perceptions are often more important to define the nature of the competition more than the material factors themselves. So this is why understanding how rivalries are talked about matters deeply. So the language, framing, and the rhetoric used in political speeches, especially elite discourses, can shape how a nation perceives the rising power and, crucially, how it reacts to the rising powers. So to address the three issues of weakness that we saw, we adopt a comparative approach that is grounded in rich data. So to contextualize the US-China rivalry, we contrasted 36 years of congressional speeches on key rivals, which include the USSR, China, and Japan, spanning 36 years, from the Truman and Eisenhower years to Reagan and Bush, during the peak of the US-Japan competition, and more recently, Obama and Trump eras. So we collected data from the Congressional Record, which is the official near verbatim record of the proceedings and debates in the US Congress. So from there, we pulled out speeches that mention key terms for each rival, the China and Chinese for China, Japan to Japanese for Japan, and Russia, USSR, or Soviet for the USSR, because Russia is mentioned more in a diverse language in those debates. So to invest how factors such as state and the party affiliation of each speaker influence the way they speak, we triangulated the speaker information with the speaker's identity with information from Congressional Directory, which provides the official biographies of the senators and the House Representatives. So basically, we extracted the date and then the topic, a speech that contained China, and then the speaker information, and then supplement the information from, like this Congressional Directory. So the final data set that we have has over 41,000 speeches, totaling more than 37 million words. So China has been discussed in nearly about 10,000 words of speeches, while Japan and the USSR were the focus of even more intensive kind of debates. So this is the empirical foundation that allows us to analyze in a quantitative way the topics and the framings of the rivalries across different eras. But beyond that, it is really the perception reflected in these debates that truly drive our conclusions. So what do we find? This slide has a lot of information, but let me break it down. The empirical results from congressional debates on the USSR first help us provide a baseline expectations to really define what the Cold War that we are referring to. So this slide shows the topics discussed in these debates. So the dark blue bars on the chart at the very top of the chart represents topics in the ideological dimension. So in total, there are around 17% of the speeches all fall into the ideological dimension, and they focus on two key topics: Eastern European independence, which make up about 9% of the discussions, and the communism in the US, or un-American activities in the US, accounting for about 8% of the total speeches. So these topics in the ideological dimension really highlights Congress's deep concern over the battle between democracy and communism, both on the global stage and also within the US society. And the medium blue bars represent the topics in the military dimension, highlighting the military competition between the two ideological blocs. So the competition can take various forms. There are direct military rivalry through alliance formation, as I highlighted here, like NATO, or the nuclear arms race, as well as indirect competition through proxy wars, especially in the case of reflected in topics such as the Korean Wars, the US involvement in regions like the Middle East or Latin America. So the last part of the chart shows the topics in the social-economic dimension, represent here. So the topics in the social-economic dimension also reflect this bloc competition. So we have the embargo on strategic materials, which accounts for about 12% of the total speech, primarily addresses the concerns about the US allies who, despite receiving the foreign aid from the United States, was supplying strategic materials to the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Similarly, about 8% of the debates revolved on the dilemma on whether the US should fund foreign aid to strengthen its allies in the ideological struggle against the communism, or focus on more about the domestic priorities. So while the topics themselves show what has been debated, we also did a framing analysis. So basically shows how the rival is discussing those kind of debates, which would provide deeper insights into the dual focus of the Cold War dynamics. So framing basically can remain the same or constant regardless of the specific topics being debated. So for instance, whether the discussion about government spending or the Korean War, a speaker could just use repeatedly the same framing, portraying the rival as an ideological expansionist to justify their argument. So as we can see here, the revisionist framing, which is the first one, the dark blue bar, portrays the rival as an ideological expansionist seeking to divide the world into competing ideologies. This framing is used in almost 45% of all the speeches. Meanwhile, the rock state, which is the second dominant framing, depicts the rival as a military aggressor involved in invasions or supporting rival regimes through military aid. This appears in about 30% of the speeches. So those two combined are the really dominant framing of the USSR at that time. And we can see that within the dual focuses, it is really the ideological concerns as the primary driver, with the military issues as a supportive but a secondary factor. So do we see similar dynamics with China? Not necessarily. So the first one is the revisionist framing, which explicitly highlights concerns about exporting ideology, accounts for less than 1% of all the speeches. And this is actually the most surprising finding we found, because we didn't really expect that it would be this little speech, this few speeches in using this framing. So in fact, when it comes to the ideological dimension, concerns about China focus almost entirely on human rights issues. About 6% of the speeches frame China as a non-violator of human rights. So this table shows the top words associated with debates on Russia versus China, and this shows the shift or contrast in the ideological dimension more clearly. So basically, we examined the entire debate and calculated how often certain words appear frequently with the keywords or anchor words here, like Russian or Chinese. So you can see that during the Cold War, US debates about the Soviet Union were primarily focused on external threats related to Soviet territorial ambitions, military power, or even ideological expansion. So words like takeover, satellite, Warsaw, summit, and troops reflect a deep concern with the USSR's effort to exert control over other nations, the neighboring nations. But in contrast, the top words associated with Chinese reflect a very different focus, more on the domestic human rights focus, with top terms including protest, repression, torture, crackdown, in relation to specific events, such as the June 4th Tiananmen incident, or the regions such as Tibet and Xinjiang, as well as specific ethnic groups like the Uyghurs. So this shift from the external focused ideological rivalry with the USSR to an internally focused human rights critique of China really represents a fundamental difference in how the US prioritizes and responds to these two rivals. The second major difference between China and the USSR is the perception of military aggression. So recall that the rock state framing was the second most dominant framing for the USSR. However, this framing is much less prominent for China, suggesting that while China is still seen as a military threat, about 17% of the speeches uses this framing, it is not viewed as the same level of military threat during the Cold War. And yet, I would like to point out, even this framing, the perception of military aggression needs to be put in the context. So there is less emphasis on direct competition with China, especially those explicitly address China's actions in South China Sea or Taiwan. So here we calculated the total appearance or frequency of key noun phrases in the documents. So basically, out of the nearly 10,000 speeches on China, North Korea was mentioned 1,236 times, and defense authorization related to the National Defense Authorization Act came up about 836 times. But in contrast, Taiwan relations, the most frequent noun phrases that contain the word Taiwan, appeared only 100 times. People of Taiwan came up for about 47 times, and this is the second dominant noun phrases that contain Taiwan in our speeches. And Taiwan Strait was mentioned 27 times, and U.S.-Taiwan relations was mentioned just 17 times. So as the speech shows, the tension with China, the speech shown on the slide here, the tension with China is often brought up after a detailed list of more urgent global challenges facing the U.S. And this implies two things, two important takeaways. The first one is China's military aggression, even in the region, hasn't been elevated to a standalone issue, but is often woven into this kind of broader debate surrounding the national defense budgeting process. The second one, which is more important, is even within this context, there's no clear consensus on the extent to which whether China constitutes the most pressing security threat to the United States. So this is the second major difference we saw from the data between the USSR and the U.S. China rivalries. So if the debates surrounding China differ from the Cold War dynamics, how should we define the nature of the relationship then? So our data suggests that the current U.S.-China rivalry shares more parallels with the U.S.-Japan rivalry of the 1980s. As we can see, again, the framing of China and Japan have mostly fallen within the social-economic dimensions, which is the bottom of the graphs. In particular, there are two frames stood out. The first one is both countries are frequently used as reference points for domestic reforms in the US. So with about 38% of speeches on China and 43% of the speeches on Japan framed in this way. So this framing basically uses Japan or China as benchmarks, either positively or negatively, to emphasize the need for the US to change the status quo or make some strategic preparations in order to avoid future vulnerabilities. And also to differentiate this framing from the competition in the military realms, we only quoted the speeches that mention Japan and China as the reference points for risks in the social economic dimension in this specific coding. So for instance, the disparities in the engineering graduates is often cited as a domestic need on education reform. Some speakers say it is not Japan's fault that we produce less than half the number of engineers than they do, despite having twice the population. So you can see like it's very similar rhetorics happened when they discuss China. Similarly, when discussing US energy policies, another speaker will point out, say, with dramatic advances in Germany, Spain, and China, our country needs a unified strategy for developing competitive domestic solar industries. And very similar narratives will appear frequently when discussing Japan in that sense. So the second dominant framing would be the framing of Japan and China as free trade norm violator, and in particular, the trade imbalances is frequently highlighted. So for instance, about 6% of the speeches on China emphasize the violation of free trade norms, and 14% of the speeches basically focus on China's role as the leading debtor to the US. So in particular, we differentiate two kinds of speeches. If the speech mentions China, say, China is going to use that day, its role as the leading debtor to manipulate U.S.-China, U.S. foreign policies, we're coded as like exploiter. But then if the speaker just point out very neutrally, say, oh, who is our biggest leading debtor? That's China. And he went on to talk about something like, so we're gonna borrow money from China to fund our healthcare. That's more of the neutral statement, and we code it as a reference point for risks. Sorry, not reference point, it's a leading debtor, sorry. So in this way, you can see that about like 20% of them are in the economic trade kind of dimension. And in the case of China, 20% of the speeches highlighted Japan as a free trade norm violator. So we can see really this kind of parallels in terms of percentage of the framing. That portray China and Japan as a free trade norm violator and its role in the trade imbalances. The parallels between China and Japan became clearer if we examine the topics discussed in these kind of debates. Again, like this graph has a lot of text in it, so let me break it down. There are 3 key points I would like to highlight. The first one is proportion of the dimensions. So again, just as the topics on the USSR, this graph was broken into like 3 different dimensions with dark blue bars, medium blue bars, and the light blue bars. And we can see that if we look at the distribution across ideological, military, and social-economic dimensions, the proportions for China and Japan are remarkably similar. So for China, we see about 8% of discussions are in the ideological dimension, 14% focus on the military issues, and about the majority, 79% center on the socio-economic dimensions. And for Japan, the pattern is very similar. About 8.5% of the discussions are in the ideological dimension, 70% of them on the military matters, and 75% of them focus on the socio-economic topics. And the second takeaway from this chart is the role of trade. So in both cases, trade is the most dominant social-economic issue. It stands out above all the other concerns like fiscal policies, tax reform, and healthcare. And thirdly, there's a significant overlap in the substantive topics discussed in relation to both countries, including fiscal policies, tax and health reform, technology and innovation, science education, and energy and agriculture, climate and environment. So again, we also look at the top words associated with both countries. The top terms associated with China and Japan show this parallel in the social-economic dimensions even more clearly. So this table shows the most frequent non-phrases in debates related to both countries. For both China and Japan, the most frequently mentioned terms include small businesses, American jobs, economic growth, trade agreements, trade bills, free trade, national debt, budget deficit, and new jobs. And then echoing the importance of the reference points for risks in the social political dimensions for both rivals, topics like healthcare, climate change, social security, and energy dominate the conversation. So in other words, rather than military threats or ideological expansion, the debates on China and Japan both centered on economic competition, focusing along with the focus on domestic agenda. So to conclude, by contextualizing the U.S. China rivalry within a broader comparative framework, we've established clear empirical basis for understanding not only the Cold War, but also a degree of similarities and differences across the various rivalry periods. So in particular, we've shown that historically, when we refer to the Cold War debates have a very clear dual focus on the ideological expansion and the military aggression, when the ideological expansion being the primary concern. And when it comes to China, concerns are focused more on human rights rather than its export of ideology. And military issues are often tied to budgetary considerations with less consensus on whether China is the dominant threat. And lastly, today's U.S.-China rivalry shares more similarities with the U.S.-Japan economic rivalries of the 1980s. So what, right? The bottom line is that the Cold War strategies are outdated and do not really offer relevant lessons for the challenges posed by China today. And I apologize for putting our dear host, the CSIS, here on the spot. Relying on the Cold War analogy has several consequences. The first one is, by framing China as a Cold War-like rival, the US really risks focusing too heavily on the military and ideological competition, especially at the global scale, missing the real nature of the competition. However, there's more to that. At the bilateral level, the backbone of today's challenges with China, such as concerns about appropriating American jobs, shown in the top terms associated with China, Japan, is virtually non-existent during the Cold War. So these economic tensions require a very different set of tools, including the measures such as reinforcing free trade practices, upgrading infrastructure, upskilling the workforce, and fostering technological innovation. And relatedly, the Cold War analogy also leads to the ignorance of challenges arising from domestic issues, such as education, opiate epidemic, and the political polarization, which we believe will be more consequential to US leadership than the challenges posed externally by China. So with that, I would like to conclude the presentation, and I hope that you can join us in rethinking the common reliance on the analogy of the new Cold War. And I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now, Evan.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I apologize for my voice. I have a little bit of a head cold. But Jiwok, thank you so much for inviting me. Shinru, very nice to meet you. Many thanks to friends at CSIS. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I've spent much of my professional life studying and working on the U.S. China relationship. Obviously, that's a relationship that has now entered a particularly complex stage, so I welcome new and interesting research as we all try to understand the nature of the relationship. So I've divided my comments on the paper basically into two parts. Strengths and I think areas where it could be improved. Pretty classic approach. And let me say, as I begin, I think that this particular event is really wonderful because it's great to bring together both academic research from Stanford with the policy community here at CSIS, people like Shinru that work on very sophisticated quantitative modeling with scholars like me at Georgetown that are largely qualitative in nature. In other words, we're people that like to do interviews, do lots of case studies, that sort of thing. So blending university scholarship with policy think tank, qualitative and quantitative approaches, I think that's an important approach. It's novel, it's important, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to be part of that kind of enterprise. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of feedback on the paper. First, strengths. I thought that the paper was uniquely clear in its purpose. I read a lot of academic papers, I review them, I comment on them, and I thought this one was particularly clear in its purpose, which was simply, is it accurate to say that the US and China have entered into a new Cold War? This is a smart question, it's a timely question. Understanding the nature of the U.S.-China relationship, obviously as a great power rivalry today, is one of the most important, if not the most important, question in international politics today. So, excellent question, and then they have a very, very clear methodology in answering that question. They examine congressional debates, both rhetoric and framing, about the Soviet Union and compare them to debates about Japan in the 80s, and of course debates about China today. So this is a smart approach. It's known in academic terms as controlled comparison, US-Soviet, US-Japan, US-China. It's historical, it's comparative, it's quantitative, great methodology. And the paper also provides a lot of interesting texture on congressional debates. I like how it broke them up into at least 3 different areas of competition: ideological, military, and economic. They create at least 13 different framing categories, which is a smart and relatively easy way to understand how these issues are debated in Congress, which of course, by doing so, allows for both cross-case comparison, but as well as comparison over time. And there's a lot of very useful reminders in this research. In the section documenting the U.S.-Japan debates, interestingly, the economic debates in the United States were as much about national security as they were about economic security, right? People forget that we had a huge debate in the 80s about Japan overtaking the American semiconductor industry when Fujitsu bought Fairchild Semiconductor, if anybody remembers those reference points. So we're sort of having very, very similar types of debates, of course, about China today. I thought it was particularly useful the way they compared the framing of U.S. debates on Japan with those about China. In other words, both are seen as norm violators and exploiters. Those are useful, interesting categories which allow us to compare these cases. Interestingly, though, as they point out in the paper, the U.S. debates about Japan were sort of tempered by the fact that Japan, in addition as being seen as a norm violator and exploiter, we're also seen as Japan's also seen as a partner, of course, it's an American ally, and a public good provider, which China is not seen as. So I thought that's an interesting point in the paper that perhaps could use a little bit of reinforcement, because that's a very interesting way in which the debates about U.S.-Japan debates differed from U.S. China. So there's a lot of goodness in the paper. Great question, great methodology, very, very well executed, and as you could see from the presentation, very, very tightly argued. So there's enormous strengths in the paper. Now let me shift to talking about areas where it could be improved. Number one, time periods. So the period that they look at for the U.S.-Soviet competition is 1947 to 1959. Obviously, the Cold War went far beyond 1959. The period they chose, 47 to 59, is the height of the Cold War. The Cold War actually had many different phases, and so one wonders if you chose a very different time period, including the period of détente in the 1970s, would you come out with very different results? So just sort of being very upfront that the U.S.-Soviet period you picked was the harshest one. Number two is the U.S. China time period. You look at 2009 to 2021. And so even the most casual China watcher, I think, could acknowledge that the U.S. debates about China are evolving on nearly a daily basis. And they've certainly evolved since 2021. And I would argue that they've expanded and intensified. For those of you that are gluttons for this research, I published a paper about a year ago through the Asia Society looking at American debates about, or the changing domestic politics in the United States. It's more than just congressional debates. And it's pretty clear that in recent years, American focus on the military dimension of the competition, specifically over Taiwan and the South China Sea, have intensified. And then, of course, the formation of the Select Committee in the Congress within the last years has influenced this as well. So I think it might be incumbent upon you to try and rerun your model if it's not too much work, and I'm sure it is quite a bit of work, to extend the time frame a bit, because you might get slightly different results, especially the growing concern in the United States about the military threat from China, specifically Taiwan and the South China Sea. Second area of improvement. The paper does exactly what it says that it wanted to do, which is measure congressional debates in a set period. But of course, in the United States, there are many other stakeholders that influence the direction of U.S. policy, right? There's the executive branch, the media, scholars and analysts, all of us in this room today, the business community, even local politicians, and by local I mean state-level politicians. So the conclusions are accurate, but they are what they are, which is relatively narrow regarding American debates on China. So the paper sort of begs the question about how important these particular stakeholders, the Congress is, in influencing U.S. Debates. Now, of course, the Congress is extraordinarily important. I argue in my Asia Society paper that, in fact, the congressional role is growing in importance. But I do wonder if the analysis would change at all if you broadened out the stakeholders that you were assessing, because, of course, as we all know, America is a big, complicated place with lots of people with different viewpoints influencing policy. Including the executive branch in one's analysis would seem like a good place to start. So that's a second point that for your consideration. Third point for your consideration. The paper begins with a very ambitious goal, I think a great goal, which is to determine if the U.S.-China relationship is a new Cold War. But of course, their test for whether it's a new Cold War is a very narrow and specific one, congressional discourse on China. So they're trying to measure whether or not a geopolitical phenomena exists, a Cold War, but they're only looking at domestic politics in the United States. So I think that it's incumbent upon them to think through whether or not, the tests that they use actually answers fully the question that they're trying to get at. Because congressional debates on U.S.-China strategic competition is not the same as U.S.-Soviet debates during the Cold War does not mean the U.S.-China experience, the U.S.-China strategic competition cannot be its own type of Cold War, just a different one with a different set of concerns. And I think that that's a big sort of cloud hanging over this paper that's never really addressed. I mean, I would say most scholars of international politics can would agree that the U.S.-China competition is very different than the U.S.-Soviet competition. And the paper acknowledges that. But in many ways, the U.S.-China competition is going to be more intense and already is more intense than the U.S.-Soviet experience because it's a competition that is economic, as the paper rightly points out, it's technological, it's diplomatic, it's military, and it may in fact be ideological. And this is all happening at the same time. So just because there are different sets of concerns ranked in different ways in the U.S.-China competition than the U.S.-Soviet competition does not mean it's any less intense or less significant or going to be easier than the U.S.-Soviet one. As I've written before, I actually think it's going to be a lot harder and a lot more complicated for the United States. So fourth and a related point is, as an international relations, professor, a Cold War is a type of event in international politics, but it's a funny type of event in international politics because there's really no agreed upon definition. Cold War was first used in a 1945 article by George Orwell, the author of 1984, where he basically refers to a Cold War as, quote, a peace that is no peace. You don't have to be a professor at Georgetown to know that's not a particularly good definition, right? I mean, what do you do with a definition like that? But the reality is that a Cold War is a type of event. It is a sort of type of, let's call it a type of great power rivalry. And so to me, I think of a Cold War as a genus and not a species. In other words, it is a category of great power rivalry. And so people talk about the Cold War, but we really should be talking about a Cold War. In other words, is the U.S.-China experience a Cold War just like the U.S.-Soviet experience or the U.S.-Soviet rivalry was, we call it the Cold War because it was the first one, but maybe the U.S.-China experience will be, obviously there are similarities and differences, but in international relations, if you think about Cold War, small c, small w, as a genus and not a species, as a type of event that can exist between two rivals in international politics, that in fact the U.S.-China strategic competition will be a Cold War, even though it will be different than the U.S.-Soviet strategic competition. So, in other words, just because something does not perfectly mirror the U.S.-Soviet competition does not mean that it can't be its own type of Cold War. So this is an excellent paper, but it's fundamentally a paper about American domestic politics, as opposed to a paper trying to measure activities or events in international politics. And specifically, it's about how Congress debates threats. It's really less about an IR question and much more about what's going on within the United States. So from my perspective, the U.S.-China relationship has all the makings of a long-term competition like the Cold War one, but of course it will be different for all the reasons that I talked about. And so I found the conclusion of the paper to be a little bit ambitious, exceeding what it actually accomplished, because what the paper does is it proves that congressional debates about China are different than congressional debates about the Soviet Union during 1947 to 1959. So that's actually quite important because it touches on a big issue, an issue that I am interested in as both a scholar and a former policymaker, which is what is the right American strategy for addressing the U.S.-China strategic competition, whether or not you like the term Cold War or not. And most importantly, can that kind of strategy be sustained? Can you build a domestic consensus that allows you to sustain a strategy of long-term competition? So I see the real impact of the paper as our understanding of congressional debates and how the United States might reach some sort of consensus about U.S. strategy and policy toward China. In other words, what does a U.S. strategy for long-term competition look like, and what kind of support from Congress does it need in order to be sustained? So one of the sort of hot debates these days, and in fact, CSIS is about to produce a volume on this, for a U.S. strategy toward China to be sustained, do you need a clear end state for that policy? Is that necessary for Congress to allocate the resources necessary, for example? And so I think that this paper sort of sheds some light on that, but the paper is what it is, which is measuring congressional debates. And so that's a very different thing than whether or not this geopolitical phenomena exists, which is, this question of the U.S. and China being in a new type of Cold War. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Evan, for excellent comments. We have a lot of issues on the table for discussion. So as you mentioned, we wanted to bring academic scholarship to Palestine community, so we have some dialogue and discussions. And we've been working on this project for more than a year now. And this is the very first public presentation, actually. So we really wanted to hear from you. And also, if you're watching online, please submit your questions as well. And as you point out, we like to be ambitious. And there's certainly, we cannot do all in one paper. But let me turn to Shinru first to respond to his comments, and then I can join as well after your comments and response. Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, good. I'm going to, thanks a lot for the constructive comments. I really appreciate it, very detailed, and point out a lot of important questions to discuss in this paper. So I'm going to respond to that in the reverse order, because I think the most kind of, the biggest question related to point 3 and point 4 are to what extent congressional discourses really speak to the question of the new Cold War, right? So I totally agree with you. I think, the debate itself on whether U.S. China is a new Cold War or not is a geopolitical debate. But then we also believe that congressional discourses, among all the kind of potential alternatives that we can measure, suits the purpose best. And here's a couple of reasons we think of. And to be honest, like when we started the project, we didn't really start with the congressional debates. We actually started with alternatives like, like the let's say, the national strategy, security strategies, or even, like the China power reports by DOD on all the things. But then we were thinking about what is the best way to measure foreign policies of the United States? Is it those reports or even Blinken, like, Pompeo speeches, right? Those are widely cited speeches or documents that refer to the beginning or onset of the U.S.-China Cold War. But then if you think deeply, right, those documents that I just mentioned, they're also about policy postures. They're not actually policies. And then for those kind of policies to be really, postures to be really translated into policies, we actually still have to come back to the Congress and think about the budget, military budget appropriations, the specific, like approval of certain sanctions. And then even for, like when we talk about a Taiwan issue, if you think about what's the most impactful things the United States did for the Taiwan in the past few years, probably the passage of the law of the Taiwan Travel Act of 2018, right? So those are things that has to be passed, debated, passed by both chambers and signed into law by the Congress. That's why, like first, in terms of actual things that can influence the policy that will lead to more substantive competition between the two countries, we think a Congress, as you mentioned in your Asia Society article, plays actually a greater role in the alternative documents that we often can think of, which are about policy postures. So that's the first thing. But then why didn't we look at the congressional bills like we just mentioned? We actually also collect all the data on the bills too, but then we realized when analyzing the bills, as they were debated alone in different chambers in the Congress, there were different versions of the bills and the revisions, right? And which version do you think is the most accurate to be analyzed in terms of those documents that can influence the foreign policy? And we said, no, not the one introduced, not the one finally passed, because either end, you're going to lose some kind of perspective to that. And that's why we come up in the end to the congressional debates, which not only reflected the initial kind of introduction of the bills, but also the debating process in which leads to the actual policies or like actual passage of certain bills. And then, which can, once signed into law, can be binding and also can transcend across different administrations, right? And also congressional debates serves a broader purpose, because if you only look at the congressional bills, no matter whether they're passed by one chamber or passed into the law, if you only look at those bills, you will only see the forest. You will still look at very specific bills that reached bipartisan consensus, but then we're really missing the forest in terms of, in comparison to those kind of very important bills related to China, to what extent this is the dominant focus, or to what extent there are even bigger or more broader focuses of the other issues related to China, right? Because all the speeches we collected analysis is not just speeches in the Congress, it's speeches that mention China specifically in those kind of speeches. So that's the second thing. We're really looking at trees versus the forest, and we believe that debates really reflect, like the broader picture. And most importantly, I think you mentioned like bipartisan and policy consensus here. Like I think like a congressional, so if we're really using the analogy of new Cold War itself lasts for over 40 years. So if the new Cold War, or whatever the term we're going to use, reflected that kind of dynamics, then it has to be long-term bipartisan in the long term, because otherwise it's still going to be changing from administration to administration. So by looking at the debates, and those kind of consensus will be reflected in the debates, as we can see in certain passages of the act. There's one act that I remember really clearly. It's nothing related to geopolitical, but China is mentioned so often in every speech framed as crisis instigator, which is about the drywall safety, which was passed into law in 2012, right? That one is about product safety. That is directly about China. That is not as prominent as like a semiconductor debates, but it's about China. It's about how China was, served as a crisis instigator of the United States domestic politics. So we think that any consensus, any bipartisan consensus will also be reflected in the debate on top of the bills that we're finally looking at. So alternative document, trees versus the forest, and also if you are looking for the bipartisanship in those kind of counter-China strategy. And most importantly, I'm glad you mentioned domestic drivers. So we have an election coming up. And I believe that domestic factors are for sure a very important factor in driving both domestic and foreign policies, including China. So again, I actually think that that's a strength rather than a weakness of using the congressional debates, which reflect the domestic drivers of how legislators talk about issues related with China. So I hope with that can understand a little bit kind of like a background and also the process when we finally come down to the congressional speeches as our data source. And then the question about yes, a Cold War or the Cold War, I completely agree with you. I think a lot of analysts has brought in definitional precision by defining the Cold War as just simply as international prolonged rivalry rather than Cold War, right? And we agree with that. We don't see like there's no competition between U.S. China. There is. As we can see, we were not denying the U.S. China doesn't have any differences in the ideological dimension. There's a huge debate about the human rights issues, and there are like economic competitions. We're just against the particular usage of Cold War, either capitalized or lowercase, to describe that relationship. We feel like it's more of the neutral terms. Why don't we just call it, not necessarily neutral, why don't we just call it like great power rivalry, right? Even the title of your book, like Cold Rivals, there are a lot of ways of describing that kind of relationship. We just feel like the Cold War itself has such a strong connotation that is based or rooted in the ideological and the military competition that it will make people miss the true nature of the competition.
And what is the true nature of the competition?
So the competition itself, as we can see, is definitely more focusing on the social economic issues.
But again, you just made a statement, the competition is focused on social and economic issues, but of course you didn't measure the competition, you just measured how Congress debates the competition, right? So there's two phenomena here. What's actually happening in the world between the United States and China, and then there's how Congress debates about it, which is even separate from how Congress legislates about it.
Right, but we believe it's not, how the Congress debates about it reflects how Congress prioritize those competition. Right, so it's more about the issue attention and priority. Of course, there are so many different issues that are in competition with China, but the most important thing is which aspect you're going to focus. And which aspect you're going to spend all the political captors, all your time in debating and passing certain, binding legislature documents that will lead to actual changes in State departments in that. So we wouldn't say, we would like to, view the debate as a reflection of how they prioritize different issues rather than say, we just debate about it. So we assume everybody, because congressional debates is happening within a very limited time. Every legislator has very limited time to speak. Their time is counted. So of the limited time, which aspect are you going to focus on? That's what we believe or what we use to gauge their priority. Yeah. So, I mean, again, like, you know, there are so many alternatives. I like your title better about like cold rivals. And also, you know, like we're not even, I'm not sure even we want to go that far as rivalry from the scholar's perspective. And this is because in the IR discipline, rivalry has a very specific definition, which is measured by the occurrence of militarized conflicts between the two countries. So it's actually not really, there are a few scholars argue that rivalry is perception, you know, best, which is subjectively categorized, but there are a lot of scholarship that only uses the occurrence of frequency of militarized conflicts. So even, you know, if you think about rivalry in that sense, it doesn't really fit with what we are experiencing here with U.S. China when the rivalry is defined in a non-academic way, right? So then the question is, okay, why not just a competition? Why not just say a normal, you know, complicated competition?
So
right?
let's, your point about rivalry is an excellent one, but let's discuss it for a second. So if rivalry, using your definition, is a sort of militarized competition, let's look at the U.S. China experience in the last few years. Of course, the Pentagon has now redefined their central mission as great power competition. An enormous amount of, you know, time, energy, resources related to procurement, planning, concepts of operations are now reorienting towards competition with, you know, a major rival like China. On the Chinese side, of course, we know their presence around Taiwan is growing. And the Defense Department publicly has said that China is on track to quadruple and perhaps quintuple the size of its nuclear arsenal by about 2035. That sounds to me like militarized competition. So I think it's important. I mean, really what we're talking about here is definitions, right? There's no set definition of what a rivalry is. There's certainly no set definition of what a Cold War is. And so, you know, I think it's important to be transparent when you say you don't want to call the U.S.-China relationship a Cold War. That may, in fact, just be a judgment call, which is entirely appropriate, but it's just you feel like that will send the U.S.-China relationship, the American debates, in a negative direction. But there has to be some objective element of that, right? And I think my argument would be that the U.S.-Soviet experience can't be the only standard. And of course, even if you look at the U.S.-Soviet experience of a Cold War, you know, a lot of it, or some of it, is quite similar to the U.S.-China experience. I mean, there is a military competition between the United States and China. I think we can all agree on that. There at least are debates about ideological differences between the U.S. and China. It may not be communism versus capitalism as stark, but there clearly are differences in domestic governance and global governance ideas. So the ideological and the military competition are there in the U.S.-China experience. And then, of course, we know there's a big economic competition, there's a big technological competition. So maybe really what we're talking about is not the components of the competition, just sort of their relative prioritization. You know, so the differences suddenly between the U.S.-Soviet competition and the U.S.-China competition starts to look a little bit more similar. And then, of course, it gets to the measurement question. I mean, the period you were measuring is like the height of the military and the ideological competition. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just important, you know, I raise all these questions not to criticize your paper, but just to give transparency to the audience that really what we're talking about here is sort of a judgment call. Do you think the term Cold War, which really has no set definition, is it something that you think is appropriate when in fact, you know, the similarities, putting words aside, definitions aside, let's just look at the objective phenomena of what's going on between the United States and China, and, you know, the similarities are striking in some instances.
So let's take a few questions from the audience. But before that, let me make maybe a couple of comments. One is, we not claim that the data we are using this is the only one. Okay, so I hope that other scholars can use different data, different method, and then provide their finding, and we have some good discussions. So that's my first one. The second one, I'm sure there's a military and ideological competition between China and United States, but the nature might be different than, let's say, military competition between U.S. and Soviet Union. For example, U.S. and Soviet engaged in like proxy war in Asia, like Latin America. But do China, U.S. engage such a proxy war? No. It's more like a potential tension over Taiwan or South China Sea. So that's why the nature may be different. And this is very important because, I think a lot of people are saying that we should have a lesson from the Cold War of U.S.-Soviet competition for the current U.S.-China conflict. If the nature is different, the lessons may be misleading, can be even dangerous for U.S. policy. So I think that's what we are trying to say. We're not saying that there's no military competition between U.S. and China. There is, but it's the same nature or different nature. That's the question that we have to address.
So there's an excellent, excellent essay on this I commend to all of you, written by Mike McFall.
Yeah.
Of course, the head of the Freeman Spogli Institute,
we sent our paper to him,
where you reside, where he actually makes this point that says, yes, the nature may be different, but it would be unwise to reject all the lessons of the U.S.-Soviet experience.
Right.
So
I think that's the main question: which lesson to take, which lesson not to take.
Right.
Yeah.
So, very well said.
Yeah, we're not categorically denying all the lessons. Yeah. Okay, so maybe there are many questions. So please identify who you are. Then ask a simple question, maybe to first. Yeah, go and then Gil. Yeah.
Hello, my name is James Siebens. I'm a fellow at the Stimson Center. Thank you very much for the presentation. I found it very informative and interesting, and I think it also highlights the importance of replication studies to see both how different kind of specifications of the model might alter the results, as Evan was pointing out. But I wanted to ask for you both to comment on the questions related to world order. That was something that I found surprising from the breakdown of topics. We commonly hear assertions that China represents a challenge or broad challenges to the rules-based international order. But I think maybe those comments may have been spread across a number of categories in your specification. I'm not sure. So I wanted to ask how that came up in your research and whether there were meaningful differences regarding world order that you found in the research.
Okay, so let's take one more question that we can address.
I'm Gil Rosman, formerly of Princeton and now the editor of the ASEAN Forum, and I specialize on China, the Soviet Union, and Japan. So all of these issues come very close to heart for me. I think this is fundamentally flawed. I think the peak of U.S.-Japan security cooperation during the Cold War was in the late 80s, precisely when you see the economic problems being raised by Congress personnel. This was the time Nakasone had raised how strong the relationship should be. We were together in dealing with the Soviet Union in a way we hadn't been before. I think also the only serious use of new Cold War with regard to China in the U.S. has come since 2019, when China changed its position on North Korea and the trade war brought us to attention to economic security, which is not a separate category. It should be a separate category. It's become so important now, connected to other security issues. And so I basically think the Soviet debate, the Soviet writings on the United States in the 1970s are strikingly similar to the Chinese writings on the United States in this new Cold War era. And that if we look at it not from congressional debates, but from others, other debates. We see striking similarities in how they blame the U.S. for Cold War mentality, which is unjustified, and say how the battle is taking place in the third world, and that China and the United States have strikingly different opinions about Southeast Asia and Korea and all kinds of other things. And the Soviet Union and the United States had striking differences about Afghanistan and other issues. I think there's very strong similarities between the Soviet-Chinese problems with the United States and very different from the Japanese discussion of the United States.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just one more then, yeah. Maybe that's, yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Ujjwala Pluri. I work on international trade at U.S. Customs, and my question is, what potential is there for the U.S., for example, to become a lead negotiator in trade agreements with Indonesia related to critical minerals like nickel? For example, leveraging India or Korea's strong relations with the Indonesian government and with Singapore as perhaps a neutral venue to take a direct role to help secure these resources. Because since the critical mineral supply chain is so essential to technologies, to semiconductors, and many other products which are critical for the functioning of modern militaries or our entire, world, digitized world, it could lead to peace not through militarization, but through ensuring the stability of the critical mineral supply chain.
So you want to respond? Yeah. Then maybe we can have a second round. Yeah.
Let me respond the questions. I can take the first two, and you can probably answer the Indonesia one. Yeah. So
I don't have an answer.
The first one is about to what extent those kind of narratives about a competing, a competition between U.S. China on the global governance appear in our debates, right? So we actually anticipate that it would be a huge category in terms of framing, but we were really surprised to see that is actually not. And then that's why we first, after we analyzing the topic, was like, hey, we have to know how these issues, how China is talked across different topics, whether they use the same narrative or not. And that's what we come up with the framing analysis. So unfortunately, this kind of debates on whether China is exporting its ideology and competing and challenging the international liberal international order at the global stage is not prominent in the debates. And I think the second question, and also one of the comments, is really related to the period selection of our study. So two responses to that. The first one is a lot of our narratives would claim that competition really intensified after 2019, and we're missing that kind of period, when there's real ideological competition, like the summit of the democracy held by the Biden administration, all those kind of things, right? Again, I rely on data to speak about, the findings. So we actually look at all the, policies, and especially the bills introduced, and also bills that are passed law from 2021 to 2024, the past Biden administration, the years, right? And we found that out of 733 bills introduced during the Biden administration, there are only 11 finally passed into the law. And then out of the 11, 4 are related to China. And out of the 4, one is about Tibet, one is about the Xinjiang worker human rights issue, one is about a Cyber Awareness Act among the small business, and the other is about Taiwan, to recognize Taiwan's status in the WHO. So those are the actual bills that are passed into law during the Biden administration, despite all the bills like United States Innovation and Competition Act of 2021, Countering Communist China Act, all these kind of things proposed. But then, if you think about all the bills that are passed into law during the time period that we analyzed, there are far more that are directly on China, not only on those topics like human rights, so basically 44 passed into law during the period that we analyzed, and including Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy, Uyghur Human Rights Policy, and Taiwan Travel Act of 2018. There's a Taipei Act of 2019, which is about Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Initiative, right? And there's also this kind of Security Cooperation Act of 2010. So if you look at actual policies, forget about if you compare those summit of democracy and also this kind of speeches, and then compare the actual policies, implemented, you can see that Biden administration is a continuation, not a brand new kind of elevation of the tensions during the in comparison to the periods that we analyzed, right? So that's why, and also the overlapping topics in those fields, human rights issues, which reinforces the finding of our research, right? So you can see that it's not, and Taiwan was frequently talked about, it reflected in the bills passed there. So we can see that there seems to be more intensive tension post 2019 or 2021, whatever, right? But on the other hand, if you actually look at, the specific substantive policy, we can argue that there's similarly or even more intense reaction to China during the periods that we analyzed. So that's the second thing about the period suggestion. And for the Soviet Union too, we actually did a moving window when we analyzed the data, because initially we just analyzed all 40 years. And now we did a moving window of 12 years across different periods. And the reason that I think I mentioned in the paper, the reason we chose this period, the initial period, it reflects the initial tension buildup as we are now when seeing the U.S. China relations. But most importantly, that period is the most likely case when you're going to find similar dynamics between the Soviet Union and U.S. rivalry vis-a-vis the U.S. China rivalry. Because think about what we're talking about today: China initiatives, the infiltration of all the kind of Chinese influence through the Confucius Institute, and then last week we have the China Week in D.C. Right, a lot of bills related to China, especially it's an influence here within the United States domestic society was discussed or introduced. So that initial period, including the potential division of certain region in Europe, like the future of Germany, which resembles the future of Taiwan in our case, right? That period was the most similar or most likely case. You'll find this dynamic that supports a new Cold War, and that's why we centered on that specific period. And of course, in the appendix of the paper, we're going to provide the results from the moving window kind of analysis to show the differences across the different periods. And that's why we're not denying any competition. We just established the empirical foundation so that people can have a clear idea of when we talk about this specific period, are we talking about anecdote? Or are we talking about systematic patterns in the specific periods? And we even provide an empirical basis for the Cold War itself so that, hey, this is what it looks like in that specific period.
Do you have time or we have to stop now? Okay. All right, so we'll take a short break and come back to the second session at 11 o'clock. They will be discussing about the rise of anti-China sentiments in U.S. allies. So please come back. But thank you again for joining, and then thank you, Shinru and Evan, for presentation and discussion. Thank you. Okay, so we wanted to continue with our second session about anti-China sentiments in the Asia-Pacific region. So Ki-dong Kim will be presenting, and then Matthew Kronik will discuss. So as in the first session, about 30-minute presentation, maybe 10 to 15-minute discussion, then we will open to the floor. So please welcome Dr. Ki-dong Kim. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, the slides are there. Yeah, I'm Ki-dong Kim. Nice to meet you all, and thank you all for attending this workshop. And I'm really excited to share our research, and I look forward to having active discussions after my presentation. So I'm going to share today one of our research projects, the U.S. alliance and public attitudes toward China, evidence from the Asia-Pacific region. Then let's get started. At least for the last 2 decades, we have witnessed the rise of China. Both scholars and policymakers discussed a lot the rise of China itself and its implications and consequences in the international system. But recently, we are witnessing the rise of anti-China sentiments. For example, in South Korea, people show unfavorable views toward China, for example, because of China's claims to Korean culture, such as hanbok, Korea's traditional clothing, and kimchi, Korea's traditional food, as well as China's distortion of Korean history. And this chart shows the tempered trend of South Koreans' attitudes toward neighboring countries, including China. So in early and mid-2000s, South Koreans actually showed similar levels of favorability toward the U.S. and China. But in their favorability toward China has dropped continuously, and in recent years, South Korea's favorability toward China is even lower than favorability toward Japan and North Korea. If we zoom out to see the patterns of the rise of anti-China sentiments around the world, by the way, by anti-China sentiments, I mean public views of China's leadership and the government, and not Chinese people in our daily lives. So if we look at carefully at the global patterns of the rise of anti-China sentiments, there were two interesting and important patterns. First, cross-national variations. Some countries, such as Canada, France, Germany, and Netherlands, Sweden, UK, Japan, and South Korea, those countries are experiencing the rise of anti-China sentiments. But others, like Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, those countries are not. And second interesting and important pattern is temporal variation. These anti-China sentiments have been increasing actually in recent years. For example, from 2013 to 2023, for the last 10 years, in Canada, anti-China sentiments have increased by about 35 percentage points. Moreover, in Japan and South Korea, anti-China sentiments for the same period have increased by about 45 and 46 percentage points, respectively. To understand these cross-national variations and temporal variations of the rise of anti-China sentiments, we argue that we need to pay proper attention to international context, such as U.S. alliance relationships and the intensifying U.S. China rivalry. More specifically, our first argument in this paper is, as the U.S. China tensions intensify, states living in allies are more likely to show unfavorable views toward China than those living in non-allies. And further, we argue that as the U.S. China tensions intensify, public views toward the U.S. and China are more likely to be conversely related to each other among those living in allies, but not among those living in non-allies. Before discussing our arguments and presenting our empirical evidence, let me introduce the existing explanations on public views toward China. Existing perspectives have largely focused on economic and ideological and military factors from China per se. I will introduce each perspective, and also I will discuss their respective limitations. So first, the economic perspective. This view explains that because banking on Beijing or relying on China's money, such as infrastructure investment loans, can raise public concerns not only about debt traps, but also about China's exploitation of labor and natural resources, thereby increasing anti-China sentiments. In other words, people in host regions, they, at the beginning, expected economic benefits and positive externalities from China's money. But at the end, they learned that this is not always the case, and it can even backfire. So they began to show unfavorable views toward China. But this view has some limitations. Before this one though, if you see the map on the left side, China's money is actually distributed and located largely in Latin American countries, African countries, and some of Southeast Asian countries. But countries in these regions do not show recently increasing anti-China sentiments, the pattern that we saw in the earlier slide. So this is the limitation of the economic perspective. In other words, the economic perspective cannot explain well about the cross-national variation of the rise of anti-China sentiments. Second, the democratic perspective. This view is quite straightforward. It explains that because of democratic values and a public support for democracy, people living in democratic countries tend to show unfavorable views toward China, which is a non-democratic country. And let's first see the left panel, the cross-national evidence. On the x-axis, there is liberal democracy score from the least democratic to the most democratic. And on the y-axis, there is favorability toward China, public opinion on China. And you can see that as the democracy score increases, favorability toward China decreases. There is a clear negative relationship cross-nationally. And if you see the right panel, which is about the case of Japan, in the past, the Japanese public had similar levels of favorability toward both the US and China. But after the Tiananmen Square incident, they dropped their favorability toward China while maintaining their attitudes toward the US. So this is the evidence from the existing studies about the democratic perspective. But this view also has some limitations because we all know that there is a declining trend of public support for democracy. So maybe many of you heard about the global trend of democratic backsliding. Despite the diminishing patterns of public support for democracy, but there is increasing patterns of anti-China sentiments. In other words, there is a mismatch between patterns of public support for democracy and patterns of the rise of anti-China sentiments. So the democratic perspective may not be able to explain well about the temporal dimension of anti-China sentiments. And the third one, the third existing perspective is a military explanation. So this view stresses that China's military rise and the concern that it might make military provocations over Taiwan and the South China Sea can raise a security threat perception, thereby increasing anti-China sentiments. But this view has also some limitations because beyond Taiwan and the South China Sea, other countries in other regions, for example, in North America, like Canada and many European countries, they are experiencing the rise of anti-China sentiments, even though they do not directly threatened by China. So, beyond the military, economic, and ideological perspective, we argue that we need to pay proper attention to larger international contexts such as U.S.-alliance relationships and the intensifying U.S.-China tensions. So again, our first argument is that as the U.S.-China tensions intensify, citizens living in allies are more likely to show unfavorable views toward China than those living in non-allies. This is because one of the most essential foundation of alliance relationships is common national security, shared national interest. Also, allies share common rules and values. And people like those who help them and sacrifice for their interest and values. And these are actually the role of allies, which can become more salient in times of crisis. In contrast, when people feel that their interests and values are under threat, they tend to generate unfavorable views toward the threatening sources. Therefore, because shared national interest and shared values are the two key foundations of U.S. alliance relationships, the growing bilateral tensions between the U.S. and China can strengthen public perception that their interests and values are increasingly threatened by China among those living in allies. Our second argument is that as the U.S.-China tensions intensify, public views toward the U.S. and China are more likely to be conversely related each other among those living in allies, but not among those of non-allies. This is because the two key foundations of alliance relationships, shared national interest and shared values, can form what we call alliance-based shared identity. And this alliance-based shared identity can, like other shared identity, generate the process of zero-sum thinking, dividing in-group and out-group, or the us versus them framework. So, the growing bilateral tensions between the US and China can lead people living in allies to view both the US and China through the lens of the alliance-based shared identity, thereby increasing favorability toward the US, their in-group, and hostility toward China, their out-group. In order to empirically test our arguments, we first analyzed the Gallup World Poll data from 2006 to 2022. And our outcome variable, the dependent variable in our statistical models, was attitudes toward China. But here again, attitudes toward China is about public views of Chinese leadership and government in the international system, not Chinese people in our daily lives. And our explanatory variables are first, US alliance status, the treaty allies, and second one is a US-China competition. Because US-China tensions are not unidimensional, but multidimensional, we consider the three rims of US-China competition: military, economic, and substantive or ideological. So military competition was measured by a CINC ratio, a composite index of national capabilities based between the US and China. And economic competition was measured by an exportation ratio between the US and China. And lastly, substantive competition was measured by United Nations General Assembly Foreign Record, the affinity index. And this is a descriptive pattern of public favorability toward China in US allies and non-allies. And not surprisingly, people living in allies, they consistently show lower levels of favorability toward China compared to those living in non-allies. But more important, the question is, do people living in allies and non-allies respond differently to the growing bilateral tensions between the US and China? And here is the evidence of our argument. So here on the x-axis, we have different degrees of US-China tensions across the three rims of US-China competition: military, economic, and substantive. Let's first focus on the military competition. As the US-China military competition intensifies, states living in allies, they are more likely to decrease their favorability toward China, which means as the US-China tensions intensify, they are more likely to show unfavorable views toward China. Substantively speaking, when the military competition changes from the minimum value to maximum value, then public favorability toward China among those living in allies drops by about 12 percentage points. But such patterns do not appear among those living in known allies, even though there is a downward, it seems like downward trend in known allies, but this is not statistically significant. And such patterns are consistent and even more apparent in economic competition as well as substantive competition. And our second argument is that as the U.S.-China tensions intensify, public views toward the U.S. and China are more likely to be conversely related among those living in allies, but not among those living in known allies. To test this argument, we now analyzed Asia Environmental Survey data from wave 3 to 5. And here, again, our outcome variable is attitudes toward China. And our explanatory variables include, in addition to the U.S. alliance status, treaty allies, and the U.S.-China competition in the 3 realms, we additionally included attitudes toward the U.S. to see the relationship between public views toward the U.S. and China. And here is our findings. Again, on the x-axis, we have different degrees of U.S.-China tensions across the 3 realms of competition: military, economic, and substantive. And at this time, on the y-axis, we have marginal effects, but you can just think of this as a relationship between public views toward the U.S. and China. So again, let's see first see the left panel, which is about the military competition. When the military competition between the U.S. and China is at relatively lower levels, there is a positive relationship because the estimate is above the 0 line. There is a positive relationship, which means that when one has a favorable views toward the U.S., he or she is more likely to have a favorable views toward China as well. But such positive relationship weakens and disappear eventually as the U.S.-China tensions intensify. And these patterns are, again, consistent and even more robust in economic as well as substantive competitions. But these patterns do not appear among those living in known allies, which is marked by the dark gray area. So, given our arguments and empirical evidence, we believe that our study can provide theoretical and academic contributions as well as important policy implications. Let me first discuss theoretical and academic contributions. First, previous studies analyzed public opinion and foreign policy by focusing on bilateral relations, for example, target effects. So studies like, for example, studies about the public opinion mechanism of the democratic peace theory found that when democratic citizens recognize that the target country is a democratic country, they are less likely to support military strikes against that democratic country. In contrast, when democratic citizens recognize that the target country is an autocratic country, then they are more likely to support military strikes against that autocratic country. But our study shows that beyond these bilateral relations, larger geopolitical contexts, such as alliance relationships and intensifying U.S.-China tensions matter for public opinion on foreign policy. And second, scholars have found that international political entities such as European Union, EU, and ASEAN can shape shared identity among those from different countries. But our study shows that U.S. alliance relationships can serve as another foundation of shared identity in the international system, and more importantly, it can play a bigger role during the times of crisis. And policy implications. Our study can provide important policy implications for not only for the U.S., but but also for US allies and China. First, from the perspective of the US needs to understand that alliance relationships matter more during times of crisis. This means that strengthening alliance relationships would be more effective than the traditional value diplomacy based on democracy, especially during the times of geopolitical crisis. And second, US allies, they need to understand that the recently increasing anti-China sentiments have in large part to do with the geopolitical context rather than bilateral relations with China. So in the past, for example, in South Korea, anti-Japan sentiments or anti-Americanism was based on bilateral relations with each country. But recently increasing anti-China sentiments are more related to geopolitical situations. Third, China. China also needs to understand the geopolitical characteristics of the growth of anti-China sentiments, especially in US allies. So this means that maybe public diplomacy may not work enough alone. Instead, China needs to improve their relations with the US to manage recently increasing anti-China sentiments in US allies. So before concluding my presentation, I will briefly introduce our future studies based on the current study that I just shared with you. Our core argument is that geopolitical context, US alliance relationships, and intensifying US-China tensions matter. So using this framework, we can also analyze Europeans' anti-China sentiments because the current study empirical findings are from the Asia-Pacific region. So we can analyze Europeans' attitudes toward China using the same framework. Likewise, we can analyze anti-Russia sentiments in both Europe and the Asia-Pacific region, given the recently increasing tensions between the US and Russia. And we are also conducting survey experiments in Japan and South Korea, two allies in Northeast Asia. So using the survey experiments, because our study shows that alliance relationships and the intensifying US-China tensions is more important. Therefore, alliance relationships would be more effective and more useful than the traditional value diplomacy based on democracy. So we want to directly examine how and why democracy can work as a US foreign policy and under what conditions it can be effective or not. And lastly, by directly comparing Japan and South Korea, we can look deeper into the dynamics of the alliance relationships. Although in this study, we just assume that allies can work similarly, but not all allies would be the same. So we can directly compare Japan and South Korea using our survey experiments to see the underlying dynamics. Thank you.
Okay, so now let's turn to Matthew for your comments and discussion.
Great. Well, thank you very much to CSIS for hosting this important discussion and for the invitation to be here. And congratulations to Dr. Kim on an interesting paper. I'm going to provide about 15 minutes of comments. And I'd start by saying overall, I liked the paper. I think it is an important question. We have seen these anti-China attitudes rising around the world. And so what is driving that? I think that's an important question. I think your answer's persuasive as well. Kind of basic international relations theory would say that, balance of threat, that countries are responding to the threat China poses. But I think you persuasively argue and show that the response hasn't been uniform, that US allies are responding differently than non-allies. And I think going to the next point in the data, I think the data persuasively show that as well. I agree there are big policy and theoretical implications from this paper. For me, one of the things that was most striking about the war in Ukraine was the way the world seemed to divide in three blocks. It seems like we realized that the free world, the United States and its allies in Europe and Asia and North America are closer than many people understood. It seems like this new kind of axis of authoritarians, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, are working closer together than others understood. But then third, and I think surprising to me, and I think to the Biden administration and others, is this kind of third category, the global south, the new swing states that weren't really willing to take sides. And I think that this is a priority for many in the West now. How do we convince these kind of swing states to join the free world side? And I think you point out what is maybe an important obstacle that needs to be overcome, that getting allies on board is going to be easier than getting non-allies on board. And I think the theoretical implications are interesting and important too, and that maybe you could even do more to bring this out, because almost all of the alliance literature does focus on why do alliances form, and starting with balance of threat, balance of power theory. But this is a little bit of a different situation, because you have alliances that were formed really to deal with a different threat originally. NATO was designed to deal with the Soviet Union, the U.S. South Korea alliance to deal with North Korea. And then now we're trying to pivot these alliances to deal with a new threat, the rise of China. And so essentially, how does one ally's rivalry with a third country affect the ability of, or the response of other allies, I think is an interesting theoretical question. And really, until your paper, I don't know of any other scholarship that addresses this question. So I think you're breaking new theoretical ground as well. So that's what I liked about the paper. I do have several questions and comments that will maybe help you improve the paper. So first was a question on scope. Why just do Asia? Because it seems like this is a question with global ramifications, and I'm at the Atlantic Council where I meet with European allies almost every day, and it has been interesting seeing the shift among European allies, whereas 5-6 years ago, most European officials I talked to essentially said, China doesn't pose a problem. Actually, it's a benefit to us. It's a good economic partner. You in the United States, you're too hard on China. And I think we've seen a big shift over the past 5 or 6 years with Europe now declaring China a systemic rival and coming closer to the United States' view on that. So I suspect this would apply to Europe as well, and I was glad to see that you see that as a next step in the research agenda, and it'd be really interesting to see what that data look like. Let's see where to go next. On the theory, well, actually, before the theory, on the kind of the existing stories about how countries are just responding to the threat, I think that's right. I might, in addition to economic, military, and values, I sometimes think of technology as a separate category of threat, and we've seen the Europeans and the Brazilians and others put in place tariffs to deal with Chinese electric vehicles, for example, which I think is not just an economic challenge, but also who's going to control the commanding heights of technology in the 21st century. So you might think about that. And then finally, also China's diplomatic activity and the wolf warrior diplomacy. And just one case study I know, talking to Swedish officials, they said that they had a Chinese ambassador in Stockholm who was very much a wolf warrior, and that the single ambassador did a lot to shift Swedish attitudes against China. So kind of China's diplomatic behavior and wolf warrior diplomacy is maybe a fifth category. Okay, so on the theory, why are we getting this different pattern from allies and non-allies? And I think what you lay out is probably right, but I think it might be more than that. And I think one interesting thing to explore might be the strategic interaction between the United States and its allies, with the United States explicitly going to allies and saying, hey, the fact that you're doing all this business with China, that's maybe a problem. So join us in de-risking from China. Going to allies and saying, hey, look at what China's doing with its human rights abuses. Join us in calling out China's human rights violations. Look at what they're doing in the South China Sea. Join us in calling for peace and stability in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. So I think there is an active lobbying effort going on by the United States to allies to get them to shift their policies. And then that's probably being reflected in the public opinion data. So I think that's a slightly different mechanism than what you lay out. And then I think the reverse is happening as well. Allies are actively taking, some allies are actively taking tougher stands on China to prove to the United States that they're a good ally. And Lithuania, I think, is a good example of this in Europe, of taking a tough stand and then going to the United States and saying, see what we're doing on China. We're helping you with your problems in the Indo-Pacific. Now you need to help us with our problems on NATO's eastern flank. I guess I do wonder too about the kind of interaction between these things, because you look at global levels of the threat posed by China, but it probably is the case that the Chinese threat, or China is more threatening to U.S. allies than to non-allies. If there's a major conflict in the Indo-Pacific, for example, very possible, if not likely, that allies like Australia, Japan, Korea get pulled into the conflict, whereas non-allies may be able to sit on the sidelines. So there, again, interaction maybe between the alliance and the objective threat that China poses to those countries. And then I guess this gets to the data. So when you measure the military threat posed by China, you look at their power scores, which is one way to do it. I do wonder, would it make sense to look at, say, militarized interstate disputes or other measures like that get directly at the military challenges that China is posing in general or to specific countries? Might be a more fine-grained way to measure that. And then also looking at the economic threat. Again, it looks like you have the global data. But I think it would be interesting to look at the trade relations that China has with specific countries and how dependent are those countries on business with China. And I suspect that that would be an important difference. I think part of the reason Lithuania has been able to get tougher with China is because they had so little economic interaction with China beforehand, whereas other countries, Germany, South Korea, more dependent on trade with China. So it seems like that would be an important thing to account for. So maybe I'll leave it there, but I think it's a good paper, and I would be interested in your responses to the questions or to comments and questions from others. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So before opening up to the floor, so let me, Gidong, have some comments or response.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, first, thank you so much. Thank you so much for serving as a discussant and great comments. Thank you so much. And I want to respond to some of your comments. Yeah, first you mentioned the military, the measure of the military threat and the economic threat, for example, like military disputes against China or economic interaction with China itself. Yeah, of course that matters. Those factors are of course matter, but one of the main purpose of this paper is to show some larger context, like cross-national variations, and at the same time, as I introduced earlier, the temporal variations, not specifically why, for example, country A sparked their anti-China sentiment in specific year, and later they sparked again, and not something like this kind of story, but we wanted to show why some groups of countries are increasing anti-China sentiments, especially in recent years. So in order to show comparative patterns, and in order to show some temporal variations of the rise of anti-China sentiments, that's why we first we focused on the military and ideological and economic tensions between the U.S. and China, not specifically about the military disputes in each country and China or military interactions with China in each country. And likewise, yes, when you talk about the theory parts, the strategic interaction, yeah, so that makes sense. And I think that I also agree with that. But I want to say that maybe the mechanisms in elite level and mass level would be quite different. So elites, they would be understand the geopolitical situations and they will make strategic decisions. But mass level, general public, they also understand, but they will respond to the geopolitical tensions through the domestic mechanisms as well. So as you said, elites strategic interactions matter. And then we may want to see how geopolitical tensions at the international level will affect, influence the mass level through the domestic elites and domestic political dynamics as well. So in short, elite and public mechanism would be a little bit different, but of course it is worth considering the elite incentives and the domestic political dynamics as well. Thank you.
So let me make maybe 2 points. One is, as with the first paper, we wanted to identify some large patterns or trends. So certainly, in both topics, you can find certain specific story, okay? But then we are asking if there's any much larger, common patterns or trends. So that's kind of our overall direction for research. And then the other one, we are working on second paper. Now U.S. kind of promoting this democracy versus autocracy framework as a diplomatic means. And it does seem to be working very well in the Asia-Pacific region. But rather, this alliance relationship seems to be more effective during this U.S. China rivalry. So that's why we are saying that the international context matters very important and it has a great policy implication for United States. Yeah. So maybe we can open to the floor. So any question? Yeah. 1, 2, yeah. Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Hi, I'm Alan Jung. I'm an undergraduate student at Georgetown University. So I have a question about anti-China sentiment in South Korea. Does that controversy, the specific action, the policy approach that China took against South Korea, doesn't that particularly plays into anti-Chinese sentiment in South Korea, not the U.S. alliances in that particular incident? Thank you very much.
So we're going to collect more questions.
I'll collect more.
Yeah, maybe one more question, then yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Aaron Kalita, no one important. My question is, how did you identify the alliances, the variable types of alliances that the U.S. is in across the globe? Were there certain alliances that caused a greater correlation or certain alliances that showed no interest? With your definition of alliance, I was just kind of wondering if there was any correlation there.
So maybe.
Yeah, for the first question, yes, definitely some specific events or, in other words, bilateral relations with South Korea and China would definitely influence public attitudes toward China in South Korea. Yes, but this specific event is not just isolated from the international situations and geopolitical context. So we believe those public attitudes toward China would definitely, in addition to the bilateral relations, public attitudes toward China would be also influenced by geopolitical context. By focusing on the geopolitical context, we can show broader and a long-term perspective to understand the public attitudes toward China. So that would be my answer to that question. And the second one, when we differentiate allies and non-allies, we measured allies based on the correlates of war data, specifically the treaty allies. So because we analyzed the Asia-Pacific region, there were 5 treaty allies like South Korea, Japan, Australia, Philippines, and Thailand. Yeah, so the treaty allies were considered as allies in our study.
Okay, so 1, 2, yeah.
Yeah, my question is actually related.
Can you say who
Yeah,
you are?
okay. My name's Anupam Khanna. I used to work for the World Bank, and I'm a game theorist, but from economics, I've shifted to geopolitics. The question that I have is that you have actually said you're looking at the broader context, but perhaps the intervening variable may require you to broaden the concept of geopolitical context, which in your case seems to be unidimensional U.S. China rivalry. That's the measure. But there are many, I think, if you're looking at a lot of Asian countries, especially outside the East Asia, Northeast Asia, the context is a wider one. I can give you the examples from South Asia. The attitude in India, which is the most remarkable rise in anti-Chinese, has little to do with, anything to do with the US. On the other, so it's directly a bilateral. But on the other hand, if you were to understand India's position vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia being both very close relations with India, you cannot understand that without understanding India's relation with China. So my question is actually to both of your, there is an intervening variable where geopolitical context is a multipolar or multi-entity one. And if you look at that, so my question is, can your research take into account that beyond the perception or just a bilateral?
Okay, here, gentlemen.
My question is more for
Can you say who you are?
Roberto Gamarra. I am a business and policy strategist. I have my own consulting company, just beginning. Dr. Koenig, I am a little familiar with, you were a commissioner in the Strategic Posture Commission. My recollection is there was no the concept of allies identity, which is a major finding of this study. My question is, how important it is for the United States deterrence strategy, military strategy, if the United States really have more sources of persuasion in regard to other allies because of this alliance identity to implement military strategy. Any comments?
Okay, so maybe respond and then we can go to the next question.
Yeah, for the first question, absolutely. I totally agree with your point that beyond the U.S. China tensions and rivalry, there would be much more, I would say, interesting and dynamic geopolitical situations, which can be very specific to particular countries. But again, because we wanted to show comparative perspective, we want to compare allies versus non-allies, which means that how allies responded differently to the geopolitical situations, not specifically about particular geopolitical or international events. So to compare allies and non-allies, we focused on the U.S. China tensions because by definition, allies and non-allies, the difference is U.S. alliance status. So that was our proposal. But again, I do agree, and I, of course, want to do further research to investigate how different situations in international relations can shape public opinion. And second, how important it is, especially for the U.S. military strategy. One thing that I want to re-emphasize is that our focus is on the mass level. So public opinion on, broadly speaking, public opinion on foreign policy, and more specifically, public opinion on China, and also public attitudes toward the U.S. So then we may be able to think of our study in terms of soft power, how the general public understand and see the international actors, especially the U.S. and China. So given that, I think by by strengthening U.S. alliance relationships, we mean that strengthening alliance relationships and signaling that we are alliance relations and you are allies of our country, then it would be more appealing to the general public in allies.
So Matthew?
Yeah, so first to the question on the Posture Commission, I do think there's some overlap between the work that we did and this paper. One, the major reason that Congress wanted to put this commission together was because of China's massive nuclear buildup, which means for the first time in U.S. history, the United States needs to deal with not just one near-peer nuclear power, but two at the same time. And so that raises fundamental questions about nuclear strategy, about nuclear posture. So I think it was the changing China threat, the increasing China threat that got us together. Second, in terms of strategy, because one of the questions this raises is, does the United States need the ability to deal with both at the same time or not? You do have some voices in Washington now loudly saying, no, we can't do it all. We just need to do one, and then allies are going to have to help with others. Usually these people say, well, U.S. will just do China, and the Europeans are going to have to deal with Russia on their own. Our commission came to a different conclusion. We said, no, the United States does need to be able to deter and, if necessary, defeat, alongside its allies, but deter and, if necessary, defeat China and Russia at the same time. There was also a broader defense strategy commission that came after us that came to the same conclusion. And then third, on the allies piece, we did engage with allies as part of the process, and I think that's important. Sometimes when the United States has gotten it wrong, they roll out new policies or strategies and then inform the allies. I think it's much better when the allies are part of the formulation of the strategy and policy from the beginning, and so we did engage allies. And then, of course, an important part of why the United States needs to have an effective strategic posture is because of extended nuclear deterrence and to reassure allies. And so we're pretty explicit in the report that that's an important reason why the United States needs the ability to deal with both for our own interests, but also to have an effective extended nuclear deterrent and to assure allies. If I could just come to this question on India, I think it's getting at one of the things I raised in a different way, but in addition to the global data, I do think it could be helpful if you're trying to understand what's driving countries' perceptions of China. Of course, the China threat, the alliance with the U.S. is important, but also those countries' bilateral relations with China are an important factor. So in India's case, the fact that India had a border dispute with China, which I think would show up in the mid-data for India and other countries, what does their bilateral economic relationship with China look like? And I understand your reasons for not wanting to do that, but I don't know the plans for the paper, but I suspect that's a question you might get in peer review as well, so it might make sense to take it on. And then finally if I could come back to the question on the elite and mass differences, I think you're right, there are differences. But if you look at the data on and the literature on public opinion in the United States, essentially political scientists say, well, there's not really a public opinion. It's essentially a reflection of elite opinions. You know, that the average person in Ohio doesn't know that much about foreign policy. They know they don't know that much about foreign policy, so they reflect what their party leaders are saying. And so I don't know if that's a finding that holds globally, but if so, I think we could expect a pretty tight correlation between the U.S. Encouraging allies to take a tougher stand on China, those countries changing their policies, then explaining to their publics why are we changing our policies, and then that showing up in the mass attitude data. So.
Okay, there's a question. Then the second one.
To Stanley Koger. Alliances provoke the formation of counter-alliances. The people outside the alliance, against whom the alliance is directed, are not going to suck their thumb. Just last week, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman in her regular briefing said, and I am quoting, "Russia and China are allies in every sense of the word." We need to look at what is going on there with their alliances all the countries that want to join BRICS, the world is dividing again in the second Cold War.
Okay, second question.
Hi, my name is Hyun Soo. I am currently a visiting junior scholar for the Korea Chair. Thank you for your presentation. My question was also based on your argument where you said forming alliances can be more effective than public diplomacy. And looking at the methods you used, I was curious, how much statistical confidence in your results do you have that the dummy variable, I assume, you used for forming alliances has a causal impact to the attitudes? Because I think it's also bi-directional possibility that attitudes can impact the alliances being formed and the other way around. And to maybe add a contextual thought I had, if an opponent country somewhere formed an alliance to another state, it's counterintuitive to think that this would have been the sole driving force, or maybe even a bigger force than public diplomacy for them to take more favorable stances. So from a results perspective, the analysis you did, because you used more regression-based approaches, and in line with our previous question, how much of a causal impact do you think there is? Thank you.
Okay, so Gidong, and you're welcome to join us. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for raising that point. Definitely, because the current study is based on observational data, which means that we can only provide a correlational evidence for our arguments. So then, the potential problem would be, of course, as you said, reverse causality would be an issue, but because during the time span, there is no change of the U.S. alliance status in our data set, which means that how ally status, the change of U.S. allies would be correlated with the geopolitical context that we focused on, specifically intensifying U.S.-China tensions. So that could be a limitation, although we agree theoretically and as our empirical evidence show that there's clear differences between the U.S. allies and non-allies given the same geopolitical situations. So despite so both groups of countries experience the same geopolitical situations, the intensifying U.S.-China tensions, but we cannot find evidence that U.S. non-allies would respond similarly to U.S. allies. But again, because this is correlational evidence, we, as I introduced in the last slide, we are conducting survey experiments so that we can isolate some confounder to directly show the causal effects of how U.S.-China rivalry can increase anti-China sentiments or favorable attitudes toward the U.S.
Anything to add?
Yeah, two comments. One, the fact that your variable doesn't change as a limitation, but in a way it's an advantage, methodological advantage as well, and almost a natural experiment. You know, we randomly distribute U.S. alliances 70 years ago based on the Soviet threat, and then take it to today, and how is that affecting the way countries are reacting to a different threat? And so I do think that's an interesting aspect of the study that, as I mentioned before, I haven't really seen much scholarship on. To this question over here, I agree, and I think that this has been one of the biggest changes in the international threat landscape over the past several years. If you just go back to the Biden national security strategy that only came out about 2 years ago, it talks about the challenge from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, but doesn't talk much about the interlinkages among them. And I think for the next national security strategy, whether it's a Harris strategy or a Trump strategy, it seems to me like that's going to have to be the defining feature, not that just that we face these challenges from these four countries, but increasingly they're working together. And so I think you're right that this is a big challenge.
Okay, here. Mike. Wait for Mike.
Hello, I am Thomas Koren. I'm here with the Czech Embassy. I would like to ask, you mentioned that you specifically conducted your research in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm wondering whether broadening it out into, well, for example, the Middle East or even the European area would maybe change the impact the alliances have on China perceptions. I have specifically in mind countries that are traditional American allies, such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, or even Hungary, which will probably have, I don't have the exact data, but I would imagine that they will probably have, they will not follow these tendencies for US allies that you mentioned in the Indo-Pacific. I'm wondering whether perhaps you mentioned with alliances that one of the very important things is shared values. I'm wondering whether with all of these countries not having the shared value of democracy, maybe that could play, and some of them even having democracies that are sliding back, right? Turkey and Hungary. I'm wondering maybe even if in those cases, the weakening of shared values actually leads to a different phenomenon than what we observed in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, so yeah, the lady.
Hi, morning. I'm Bhagya from Singapore Straits Times newspaper. Now, I was wondering if ASEAN, Southeast Asia, presents a sort of an exception to the kind of findings you presented. Because even as alliance building has gone on in Asia, US alliance building, as you know, the perceptions of China have become favorable. And if you're aware of the study last year by a survey by the Institute of Southeast Asia Studies, you've seen favorable China being described as the region's preferred superpower. So I'd like to understand how you explain this kind of finding. Thank you.
Good question. So hold on. So let's come back to Kidong and Matt if you want to join. Yeah.
Yes. First, beyond the Asia-Pacific region, maybe similar related to Professor Koenig's comments, it definitely, of course, as the author of the study, we would argue that our framework and theory would work in other regions as well, but it needs empirical test. And specifically in the Middle East, and in terms of the democracy, the shared value, so I just want to briefly mention about our second paper. Yeah. So as I introduced briefly in the last slide, we are doing a research about how and why, and more important, under what conditions the value diplomacy, the democracy can work or not. And our main argument is actually democracy can be understood as different meanings. So each different regions and each country, because of their historical trajectories, people have a different understanding of democracy itself, which means that even though the shared values as democracy can be delivered from the United States as their foreign policy, but public perception in, for example, Northeast Asian countries and Middle East Asian countries, they would, especially the mass public, they would understand quite differently. Then the value diplomacy, its effectiveness would depend on this kind of the different meanings of democracy in each region. So I really wonder how we can show the findings later. But definitely that's, we agree with your point, and we want to investigate more deeply that issue, yeah. Yeah, and ASEAN, yes, of course, in the Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN members, they would respond differently. Each country would be respond differently to the geopolitical context as we focused on, because we focused on the U.S.-China tensions. but they will different in terms of the effects of U.S. China tensions. But again, we want to show some comparative perspective by showing that how treaty allies and non-allies would respond differently, not specific about how each country will respond to the same geopolitical situations. So maybe that would be an important question, but I want to leave it to future research. Thank you.
Let me comment, and maybe I'll come to your defense a little bit, because I think one important aspect is how to think about defining and measuring ally, because in kind of the U.S. foreign policy context in Washington, we often refer to every country as an ally or a partner. But for the study, you focus on formal treaty allies, and I think that makes sense. So these are places where we've signed a piece of paper saying we'll fight and die for each other. And so that's kind of a level of alliance that's different from a general partnership with a country. So I think for Southeast Asia, your study actually shows you agree that in Southeast Asia, the United States, other than the Philippines and Thailand, does not have formal treaty alliances. And so your expectation would be that those countries wouldn't be showing the same anti-China attitudes that you're seeing among the formal treaty allies like Japan, Australia. And so that's what your data show. And I think you're saying the same thing, that in Southeast Asia, you're seeing pretty favorable views of China in many places. So I think you agree. And then here, believe it or not, in the Middle East, the United States has 0 formal treaty allies. So we often refer to Israel or Saudi or as partners or allies, but no formal treaty allies there. So I think that would be put to the side. And then in Europe, it would be interesting to look at Hungary or Turkey. What are the views of China there compared to other allies? But I do think that your overall finding would still hold up. And I don't know if you see it differently, but it does seem like overall you have seen shifts in anti-China attitudes across Europe, and I think that's what you'd predict, that allies like NATO allies in Europe are going to see a bigger shift than in non-allies. And anecdotally, you know what I'm saying? I think we have seen that in recent years.
Okay, and then 2 more. Yeah, it's a lot of questions.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. My name is Yuko Mukai of a Japanese newspaper, Yomiuri, and also non-resident fellow Project 2049. My question is about the word anti-China. So in your research, what's the definition of anti-China? Is it like anti-Chinese government or anti-Chinese Communist Party or anti-Chinese people? Because through my experience as a journalist and also a researcher, I've seen a lot in Taiwan, in Japan, and in the United States. And people often mentioned that they are threatened by the country or the party, but they don't necessarily hate Chinese people, right? So we have to be very careful about how to define that. So I'm just very curious how, in your research, how would you organize those kind of feeling? Thank you.
Okay. So here.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Pierre-Etienne Courrier. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown University in the Department of Government. My question is more in terms of a clarification within the argument that you're presenting about allies and the fact that if I'm understanding correctly, the data you're presenting about the allies is based on U.S. China interactions, on the U.S. China rivalry, and therefore how that reflects on U.S. allies in terms of anti-China sentiments. My question then is, what justifies kind of the assumption that the specific U.S.-China rivalry and interactions that are happening affect specifically and directly U.S. allies' positions? Obviously, I'm thinking about in the European context specifically. Obviously, there's interaction between the U.S. and its allies in Europe in terms of position. But the EU specifically has a very specific position about China as well. And I'm thinking in Europe specifically, the Netherlands has taken specific actions and has specific interactions as well with China that has affected possibly anti-China sentiments within the country. And therefore, if we assume that U.S. China interactions affect U.S. allies' sentiments regarding China, what does that imply about the agency that allies have on their positions regarding their position on China, and how can we justify kind of this, the fact that it's the U.S. that is affecting allies in that regard? Thank you.
Yeah, first let me clarify the anti-China sentiments here, what we mean by anti-China. So as I mentioned during my presentation, we meant public views toward Chinese leadership and China as a country in the international system, not Chinese people in our daily lives. So basically, because we are focusing on the geopolitical context, we wanted to know about how people, general citizens, think about the role of China in the international system. Yeah. So in our empirical analysis, the dependent variable was specifically how would you evaluate China, the influence of China in the international system. Yeah, that was the wording of the dependent variable that we used. Yeah, and yes, for the second question, let me answer based on my focus, based on my perspective. So our argument is basically, in the face of growing bilateral tensions between the US and China, allies and non-allies would respond differently, especially general citizens. The public in allies and non-allies would respond to the geopolitical situations differently. So then, of course, you can ask then, what's the agency of allies? Of course, as I mentioned in the conclusion section, allies, they need to understand that the anti-China sentiments at the mass level is because of the geopolitical situations, which means that although the geopolitical situations would limit the rooms where allies or non-allies and the countries can decide, make strategic decisions in the foreign policy area, but there is still some rooms that they can deal with their relations with the US, with China. So I think at least because the anti-China sentiments is related to the geopolitical situations, allies as an independent country, they also need to think about their own relation with China as well.
I'll just add briefly, if I could, since you mentioned Netherlands and Georgetown, because I do think this is a case that is consistent with your theory. So Mark Rutte visited Georgetown in January 2023, gave a public address, and according to the press reports, he was in town because Biden wanted to meet with him about the Netherlands putting in place tougher export controls, about chip tool making going to China. And shortly thereafter, the Netherlands did put in place the first round of export controls, and just a few days ago released some tougher, even more stringent export controls. So I think this is a good example of where Netherlands had its own concerns, but I think it was the interaction with the United States, including Rutte with Biden in the White House 2 years ago, that helped to drive the final policy. And I guess to your dependent variable, is that showing up in the public opinion polls in the Netherlands? I suspect it is, but I don't know.
Okay, so I think time is almost up. And then, as I mentioned earlier, our policy lab is fairly new. It's only like 1 year old. And this is our really first public presentation of our research findings. And we are working on multiple projects. Please visit our website. As I mentioned, we will be presenting about racism denial by 16 Asian countries tomorrow at George Washington University. So, our goal is to provide empirically based rich data and analysis, and that has some policy implications. So we have no political agenda to to push, or you're not really engaged in any policy making per se. But hopefully our research can help policymakers in thinking about formulating their policy toward China and other countries in Asia. So I think that's our goal. That's why we are here, to engage our policy community. And thank you again for your attendance, and also thanks to CSIS Victor Cha for hosting. So now back to you, Victor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Shin, for bringing the SNAPL lab to CSIS. I think you've made a lot of new fans of the lab, and hopefully you'll be able to see some of the other presentations they do this week. I also want to thank you for really putting these rising stars, junior scholars, on the stage to talk about their research and really giving them that experience. I think that's a very important part of what you're doing as well. And I also do appreciate the fact that the lab is focused on data and research, policy application, of course, but data and methods, on topics that are very highly partisan and polarized. And so I think the more data and methods and research we can bring to these sorts of topics is very good. I want to thank also my colleagues, Matt Kroenig and Evan Medeiros, both very busy senior scholars working both in policy and in research at the beginning of a very busy semester to take the time out to read these papers and to offer really excellent comments. And I want to also thank our audience for your engagement, for those of you here and online for the SNAPL lab. So with that, thanks to everyone and good luck with the rest of the presentations. Oh, I will say, one other thing I will say is that on September 26th, we will be having an event here at CSIS about the global impact of the U.S. presidential election, where we will cover everything from Africa to Asia. So please come join us for that. That is the morning of September 26th. Thank you.